January 1942, off the coast of North Carolina. The night was cold, clear, and terrifyingly dark. For the crew of the oil tanker SS Alan Jackson, the journey from Venezuela to New York was supposed to be routine. But in the inky blackness beneath the waves, a specter was watching. It was the German U-boat U-66, one of the first predators of Admiral Karl Dönnitz's Wolfpack to be unleashed upon America's unprepared eastern seaboard. Through his periscope, Kapitän Leutnant Robert Richard Zapp saw the tanker silhouette against the faint glow of the distant shore. He gave the order. 2 torpedoes leapt from their tubes. The explosion was instantaneous and catastrophic, a flash of white-hot light that turned night into day, followed by a deafening roar. The Alan Jackson, carrying 72,000 barrels of crude oil, was turned into a floating inferno. 22 of her 35 crewmen were killed instantly. For the next 6 months, this scene of fire and death would repeat itself, night after night, along the American coast in what the gleeful U-boat crews called the second happy time. They were sinking ships faster than the Americans could build them, threatening to sever the vital lifeline to Britain. The Allies faced an impossible problem. How do you defend thousands of miles of coastline against an enemy that is utterly, terrifyingly invisible? The answer would come not from a battleship or a new type of destroyer, but from a weapon that most of the world had written off as a relic of a bygone era, a ghost from the age of the Hindenburg. The entry of the United States into the war in December 1941 was the moment Admiral Karl Dönitz, the shrewd and calculating commander of the German U-boat fleet, had been waiting for. He immediately launched Operation Paukenschlag, or Operation Drumbeat. The plan was brutally simple: to unleash his U-boats on the dense, poorly protected shipping lanes along the American East Coast. The American response, or lack thereof, was shocking. Coastal cities remained brightly lit, providing perfect silhouettes for the U-boats to hunt by. Merchant ships sailed alone, without convoys, broadcasting their positions in plain language. For the veteran U-boat commanders, it was not a battle, it was a slaughter. They called it the second happy time. In just the first 6 months of 1942, the Wolfpack sank nearly 400 ships in American waters, sending millions of tons of vital war material and thousands of sailors to the bottom of the Atlantic. The beaches from Florida to New Jersey were littered with oil and wreckage. The glow from burning tankers was often visible from the shore. America, the greatest industrial power on Earth, was being strangled in its own backyard, and its Navy seemed powerless to stop it. The core of Dönitz's strategy was the Rudel tactic, the Wolfpack tactic. Unlike the lone wolf submarines of World War I, Dönitz's U-boats operated as a coordinated team. A single U-boat patrolling a vast search area would spot a convoy. It would not attack immediately. Instead, it would shadow the convoy, radioing its position, course, and speed back to U-boat command in France using the complex Enigma code machine. Headquarters would then vector in other U-boats from across the Atlantic, assembling a deadly pack. They would wait for the cover of darkness. Then, under the command of the most experienced captain, the Wolfpack would strike, often launching their attacks from the surface, where their low profile made them almost invisible in the darkness. They would fire their torpedoes and then crash dive into the depths, leaving chaos and fire in their wake. For the Allied sailors, it was a terrifying, nerve-shattering experience. An attack could come from any direction, at any time, from an enemy they could never see.
Inside dem deutschen U-Boot, es war eine andere Welt. Ein Typ 7 U-Boot, der Workhorse der Fleet, war ein krampft faulschmellender 220 Fuß Stahltub, packt mit 50 Men, Diesel-Engines, elektrische Motoren, Batterien und 14 deadliche Torpedos. Live war ein konstantes Stet von Tension und Klaustrophobie. Der Art war dick mit dem Schmall von Dieselfuel, ungewaschenen Bodies und Kochfumes. Privatio war non-existent. Aber es war auch eine Welt von Elite-Professionalismus. Der Kommandant, oft ein Mann in seinem Let 20, war ein Gottking in seinem kleinen König. Der Hydrophonoperator mit seinem sensiblen Listing-Gear war der Bootsehren, able to distinguish den Sound eines Tankers Propeller von einem Destroyers. Die Torpedomechaniker waren Meister der Kraft, metikulös maintainen des Komplex Eels, die waren ihre einzige Waffe. Diese Männer waren die Elite der Kriegsmarine, bunt zusammen durch einen gemeinsamen Sinn von Purpose und der konstante, intimante Präsenz von Dode. Diese Männer waren skilled, sie waren brav und in 1942, sie wären winnen das Battle der Atlantik.
In Washington, D.C., the mood was one of growing desperation. The U.S. Navy's destroyers and corvettes, the traditional submarine hunters, were too few in number and were needed for convoy duty in the North Atlantic. Aircraft like the PBY Catalina had the range, but they were too fast. They could spot a U-boat on the surface, but the sub would crash dive long before the plane could get into position for an attack. The Allies needed a new kind of weapon. They needed an aircraft that could fly incredibly slow, that could stay on station for days, not hours, and that could carry the brand new secret technologies of radar and magnetic detection. The answer came from a small, almost forgotten branch of the U.S. Navy, championed by a single stubborn admiral. The answer was the blimp. To most, the idea was absurd. The age of the airship was over, a romantic but failed experiment that had died in a fiery spectacle with the Hindenburg in 1937. But Rear Admiral Charles E. Rosendahl, the Navy's foremost expert on lighter-than-air LTA flight, saw their unique potential. Rosendahl argued, against immense skepticism, that the very qualities that made blimps useless as offensive weapons made them the perfect submarine hunters. A blimp could take off and stay aloft for over 24 hours, with some missions lasting over 50 hours without refueling. It could travel at a leisurely 50 knots, slow enough to meticulously scan the ocean's surface. Or it could simply stop and hover motionless in the air for hours, listening. A U-boat commander's greatest advantage was his ability to disappear. A blimp's greatest advantage was its infinite patience. In 1942, Roosevelt, desperate for a solution, gave the go-ahead. The U.S. Navy embarked on one of the most ambitious and unusual aviation programs of the war. They ordered the construction of a fleet of over 160 K-class blimps to be based at a string of massive new coastal air stations stretching from Massachusetts to Brazil. The ghosts of the airship era were being reborn. The K-class blimp was an engineering marvel, a perfect blend of old technology and new. It was a 252-foot-long behemoth, its massive envelope filled with over 450,000 cubic feet of non-flammable helium, making a repeat of the Hindenburg disaster impossible. Suspended beneath the envelope was the control car, a 40-foot gondola that served as the crew's home and nerve center. It was powered by two powerful 550 horsepower Pratt & Whitney Wasp radio engines, giving it a top speed of nearly 80 miles per hour, but also the ability to cruise efficiently for days on end. The crew of 10 men, pilot, co-pilot, navigator, bombardier, mechanics, and radio men, lived and worked in this cramped space, often for missions lasting longer than 24 hours. The control car was equipped with bunks, a small galley, and even a toilet, but the conditions were far from luxurious. It was a cold, vibrating, and noisy environment, demanding incredible endurance from its crews. But what made the K-class a truly revolutionary weapon was the secret technology it carried. First, it was equipped with the latest microwave radar. Mounted on the front of the control car, it could scan the surface of the ocean for miles in any direction, capable of detecting the tiny, fleeting signature of a U-boat's periscope or snorkel, even in rough seas or at night. The second secret weapon, however, was even more exotic. It was the Magnetic Anomaly Detector, or MAD gear. This was a highly sensitive instrument, usually trailed on a long cable beneath the blimp, that could detect the tiny distortions in the Earth's magnetic field caused by a large metal object like a submarine, even when it was completely submerged. For a U-boat commander who believed he was invisible in the depths, the MAD gear was a terrifying prospect. It meant that even underwater, he was no longer safe. The blimp was not just a pair of eyes, it was a hunter that could see in the dark and even see underwater. The third element in this deadly triangle was the merchant marine, the civilian sailors who manned the tankers and cargo ships that formed the Allied lifeline. For these men, the Battle of the Atlantic was a personal and terrifying ordeal. They were not soldiers, yet they were on the front lines of the most brutal campaign of the war. Their ships, often old and slow, were filled with thousands of tons of high-octane aviation fuel, explosives, or vital war materials. When a torpedo hit, the result was often an instantaneous, catastrophic explosion. A tanker carrying aviation fuel could be vaporized in a ball of fire, leaving no survivors. For those who did survive the initial blast, the ordeal was just beginning. They would find themselves thrown into the freezing, oil-slicked waters of the Atlantic, often at night, with little hope of rescue. The fear was a constant companion. Every sunset brought a new wave of anxiety. Every strange noise, every shadow on the water could be a U-boat. As the blimp patrols began in the summer of 1942, the merchant sailors looked up and saw these strange, slow-moving gas bags joining their convoys. Initially, there was skepticism. What could these clumsy, vulnerable-looking airships possibly do against a deadly U-boat? But they soon came to see the blimps as guardian angels. The presence of a K-class blimp hovering patiently above the convoy had a profound psychological effect. It was a visible sign that someone was watching over them. For the blimp crews, the missions were a grueling test of endurance. A typical patrol would last 20 to 30 hours. For hour after mind-numbing hour, the crew would scan the endless, empty expanse of the ocean. The navigator would meticulously plot their course. The radio man would listen for any friendly or enemy signals. And the radar operator would stare at the hypnotic green sweep of his screen, searching for the tiny, fleeting blip that could mean a U-boat. It was long, boring, and exhausting work, punctuated by moments of sheer, heart-pounding terror. On the other side of the looking glass, the German U-boat commanders began to encounter these new, strange adversaries. At first, they were dismissive. The blimps were slow and appeared to be easy targets. But they soon learned to hate and fear them. Kapitänleutnant Helmut Rathke, commander of U-352, wrote in his war diary after an encounter with a blimp off the coast of Florida, "The airship appeared suddenly out of the clouds. It is impossibly slow. It just hangs there, watching. We were forced to dive, unable to surface to recharge batteries, unable to get into a favorable attack position. It followed us for 4 hours. We could hear its engines through the hull. It is a psychological torment. It does not let go." This was the true genius of the blimp. It wasn't primarily a U-boat killer. It was a U-boat neutralizer. The dynamic of the hunt was a fascinating clash of technologies and tactics. A U-boat's only defense against a blimp was to dive deep. But it couldn't stay submerged forever. Its batteries would run down, and its air would become foul. It had to surface eventually. The blimp's weapon was its infinite patience. It could simply hover over the U-boat's last known position and wait. This created a tense underwater chess match. The U-boat commander would try to sneak away, changing course and depth, hoping the blimp would lose contact. The blimp crew would use their radar to watch for a periscope. their mad gear to search for a magnetic signature, and their own eyes to look for the subtle signs of a submerged sub. An oil slick, a trail of air bubbles, or the faint dark shape of the hull beneath the waves. When a blimp did get a solid contact, the attack was swift and direct. The K-class was armed with 4 Mark 47 depth charges and a single .50 caliber machine gun. When the mad gear screamed its high-pitched tone, indicating the blimp was directly over the submerged submarine, the bombardier would release the depth charges. For the crew inside the U-boat, it was a terrifying experience. The explosions were like giant sledgehammers pounding on the hull. Lights would shatter, pipes would burst, and the boat would be thrown about violently. The psychological pressure was immense. Even if the depth charges didn't rupture the hull, the constant threat, combined with the depleting air and battery power, would often force the U-boat commander to surface and face his tormentor. And once on the surface, the U-boat, with its thin pressure hull, was incredibly vulnerable to the blimp's .50 caliber machine gun fire, which could tear through the hull and disable its engines or deck guns. One of the most dramatic and well-documented encounters took place on the night of July 18, 1943, in the Straits of Florida. The blimp K-74, piloted by Lieutenant Nelson Grills, picked up a radar contact. It was a large German U-boat, the U-134, running on the surface. Grills decided to attack. He brought the blimp down low and fast, charging directly at the submarine. The German crew, stunned by the sudden appearance of the massive airship, opened fire with their deck guns. The K-74 was riddled with cannon shells. Its starboard engine burst into flames. Yet, Grills pressed the attack. He flew directly over the U-boat, but a mechanical failure in the bomb bay meant his depth charges failed to release. With his blimp now crippled and losing helium, he was forced to ditch in the ocean. The crew of 10 men escaped into their life raft, but tragically, one of them was attacked and killed by a shark before they were rescued 12 hours later. The U-134, though damaged by the blimp's machine gun fire, managed to escape. The story of K-74 is remarkable because it was the only U.S. Navy blimp to be shot down by a U-boat during the entire war. It was a story of heroic failure, but it proved the rule. The blimps were not invincible, but they were incredibly effective. Their mere presence over a convoy was enough to keep the wolves at bay. A U-boat commander, who relied on stealth and surprise, simply could not operate effectively with a 252-foot-long observer hanging in the sky above him. He couldn't surface to use his deck gun. He couldn't surface at night to recharge his batteries and use his superior surface speed to get ahead of the convoy. He was forced to stay deep, stay slow, and ultimately let the convoy pass. The blimps were not primarily hunters, they were shepherds, and their flock was the irreplaceable fleet of merchant ships. As the war progressed, the effectiveness of the blimp patrols became undeniable, written not in headlines, but in cold, hard statistics. The U.S. Navy's lighter-than-air, LTA command, grew into a massive organization. At its peak, it operated from 17 major naval air stations, with a fleet of over 160 blimps, flown by over 1,400 pilots, and supported by 3,000 ground crew. The massive wooden airship hangars they built, some of which still stand today, were the largest clear-span wooden structures ever built, each one capable of housing 6 K-class blimps. From 1942 to 1945, these gas bags became a ubiquitous sight along the coasts of the Americas and in the skies over the Mediterranean and the Atlantic. They were the unsung and often unseen guardians of the sea lanes. The operational statistics compiled after the war are nothing short of staggering. U.S. Navy blimps flew a total of 55,900 operational flights, escorting 89,000 ships across hostile waters. In over 550,000 hours of flight time, they maintained an incredible operational readiness rate of over 87%. But one statistic stands above all others, a number that serves as the ultimate testament to the success of the Blimp program. Of the 89,000 ships that sailed in convoys escorted by U.S. Navy blimps, not a single one was lost to an enemy submarine. Zero. It is one of the most remarkable and least known success stories of the entire war. The invulnerable hunter had created a truly invisible shield. The presence of the slow, clumsy, and seemingly obsolete airship was the perfect defense against the fast, sleek, and technologically advanced U-boat. Why were they so successful? The answer lies in a combination of factors. First, endurance. A blimp could stay with a convoy for its entire journey through the most dangerous coastal waters. Second, visibility. From its vantage point 1,000 feet up, a blimp crew could see for miles, spotting periscopes where surfaced U-boats that ships could not. Third, technology. The combination of radar and MAD gear allowed them to hunt an enemy that was trying to hide. But the most important factor was psychological. As one captured U-boat commander, Kapitän Leutnant Werner Hartenstein, stated during his interrogation, "We did not fear the blimps as killers. We hated them as observers. You could not shake them. They were always there. They took away our greatest weapon, the element of surprise." The blimps won not by sinking U-boats, but by making it impossible for them to be effective hunters. After the war, the lighter-than-air program was quickly dismantled. The age of the jet and the nuclear submarine had begun, and the slow, majestic blimps seemed like relics of a bygone era. Their incredible story, their unbeatable record, was largely forgotten, relegated to a footnote in the grand histories of the war. There were no epic films made about them, no famous aces. Their war was one of long, boring patrols, of patient observation, and of battles that were won simply by preventing them from ever happening. They were the ultimate heroes of the unseen front. Their victory was measured not in ships sunk, but in ships that arrived safely at their destination, delivering the tanks, the fuel, the food, and the soldiers that would ultimately lead to the liberation of Europe. The story of the U.S. Navy blimps versus the German U-boats is a powerful lesson in the nature of warfare. It proves that the most effective weapon is not always the fastest, the strongest, or the most technologically advanced. Sometimes, the most effective weapon is the one that is simply the most persistent. It is a story of how an obsolete technology, when applied with a new strategy and new tools, can defeat a modern menace. It is a testament to the courage and endurance of the thousands of airmen who flew these forgotten airships, spending countless hours in the cold, lonely skies over the Atlantic. And it is a tribute to the fundamental truth that sometimes the greatest victory is the battle that was never fought, the ship that was never sunk, and the life that was never lost, thanks to a silent guardian watching from above.